A gifted teacher, a field expert, as we're about to discover, Professor Nota Kourou will now take us on a journey to the Cyclades and will speak on excavating the past and its people, a fortified settlement and its cemetery at Xobourgo on the island of Tenos. Professor Kourou, the floor is yours.
Please should look. Can you hear me now?
Yes, but we cannot see you.
Well, it's up to you to start video and see me. I can't do anything. I try. Unable. There is a notice unable to start video. Mr. Karas should do something. Well, anyway, let me try and see if I can share the screen. Yes, I can. That's fine. Share. Start my video.
There you are. We can see you now.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
Thank you, dear chair lady. I also want to express my thanks to the Greek Archaeological Committee for this invitation. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to be able to present to this audience the results of our excavations at the site of Xobourgo on Tenos, a site that has been emerging gradually since 1995 through the Athens University excavations. What we are going to do in the following minutes is to focus on the main places of the excavated site, so that at the end, we can have an idea of the settlement, the cemetery, the history, and mainly the culture of the people that lived at Xobourgo. Xobourgo is the name of a very steep granite rock that rises at the center of the southern part of the island of Tenos, attaining an altitude of about 600 meters. You can see that on our screen. It overlooks important routes across the island, and from its summit, most of the coastline can be observed. The hill lower down spreads.
Professor, we lost your sound. We lost your sound. We cannot hear you.
I don't know. Now, can you
now,
hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, the hill lower down spreads out in terraces with fertile land and a good water supply. It is not surprising, therefore, that an extended settlement developed here very early in the Iron Age.
Professor, we're losing your sound.
Now, I'm sorry, it's your problem. I can't. Now, can you hear me? Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Please tell me when you can.
I can hear you, Nota. I can hear you very well. I have not lost anything. And everybody else in the chat says that they can hear you. Yanni, maybe it's your problem?
Shall I continue or not?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. The earliest settlement was established on the highest part of the southwest slope of the Xobourgo hill. A cyclopean wall, 3 meters wide, encircled a very small area exactly at the foot of the slope. Today, Only the western rampart of this wall is still standing, while from the southern and eastern parts of this fortification, only small sections are preserved. The cyclopean wall was built with huge granite blocks without any foundation trench, and also without binding material. That is, it was constructed in the dry stone wall system used for Mycenaean walls. But at this site, there is no evidence whatsoever of Mycenaean settlement. Yet, the same system occurs in the post-Palatial and early Iron Age periods at some places in Crete and the Cyclades, and as it seems, this is the case for our wall too. The granite blocks of the cyclopean wall were cut out of the upright rocks standing at the foot of the Xobourgo hill. Thus, they were easily transported just a few meters downslope to create the powerful fortification wall. Traces of the quarrying can be seen today on the rocks inside the small fortified area, as well as on the blocks of the wall. This small community living inside the cyclopean fortification gradually grew larger and expanded outside the fortification wall, all over the southern part of the hill, perhaps residing mostly in farmhouses. In this way, the largest part of this extensive settlement, lying outside the cyclopean wall, remained unfortified until the very end of the Archaic period, when, in view of the oncoming threat of a Persian invasion into the Aegean, it acquired a new fortification wall. This new wall is also 3 meters wide, and at some parts it survives to 4 meters high, partly concealed under modern rubble. But most parts of it are either now buried below ground level, or they are visible but badly preserved. The course of the new archaic wall followed the edge of the terraces to join up with the western cyclopean rampart, so that the entire settlement was eventually fortified. Anything in its way had necessarily to be removed or ignored to allow it to do so. This explains the perfect state of preservation of everything on the narrow terrace in front of the cyclopean wall. This place, just outside the cyclopean wall, a space for mortuary rituals and the cult of the dead was revealed. Here, a series of successive cultic activities with abiding mortuary and chthonic aspects have been revealed mostly below the archaic wall. The earliest cultic activity identified here in this narrow terrace just outside the gate of the cyclopean rampart is a type of ancestral cult centered on a small platform over an empty shaft grave. The platform is made of small pebbles fixed into a small clay floor, which is above a shaft grave that was found empty of its original contents, but filled with sand that had been brought up the hill from the coast, located 6 kilometers away. A huge boulder over the shaft evidently functioned as its marker. This is a type of ancestral calc also known from other places, such as Naxos or Euboea. The date of the empty shaft grave and the platform is inferred from some late protogeometric search found in the area of the Peeble floor. The next stage of cultic activity on this terrace takes the form of a number of fire pits, that is, offering pits, dug into the bedrock and set inside enclosure walls. The ceremony was based on a fire that was lit in each fire pit, into which offerings were thrown. The ritual was completed by casting into the pit a heap of stones to extinguish the fire and thus create a small stone tumulus over the fire pit. Some of these tumuli have been nicely preserved below the later archaic wall that covered them, as we can see here. Occasionally, 2 or 3 pits dug side by side became joined to one another and so formed a unit. 3 enclosure walls have been found that covered the entire terrace, some of them well preserved. They all belong to the geometric period, mostly middle geometric, late middle geometric, and late geometric one. The large number of fire pits on this terrace implies, we think, a form of cultic activity shared by many people, while the enclosure walls and the composite pits indicate that this activity was conducted by families of a complex, possibly tribal society. For better understanding this ritual, we must have a brief look at the offerings in the fire pits. They include 1 or 2 personal objects each, such as, for example, a knife, a fibula, or a ring. Bone rings were favored. Pottery shards, but also quite a number of animal bones, implying that the first part of the ritual included a meal. After having dropped the offerings in the fire pit, they threw small stones to create a small tumulus, but the last stone was always a huge peeble brought up here from the sea. The large peeble, having a purifying symbolism as related to seawater, evidently concluded the ritual in the pit. But towards the end of the late geometric period, the use of fire pits was abandoned and the terrace was reorganized. At about the center of the terrace, a large hearth and a schara, lined by 4 monolithic slabs of schist, was established. The retaining wall, just opposite the schara, was reshaped into a long and spacious bench to better serve the ceremonies occurred on the schara. The area between bench and the schara was paved. The existing fire pits were sealed. The schara itself was constructed above a former large fire pit. Next to the Eschara, a huge deposit of ashes, embers and sooty earth was found, full of burnt bones and pottery sherds. The large size of the ash deposit and the considerable number of fragments from cooking pots found in the Eschara imply repeated sacrifices on a large scale, performed now not just for the ancestors of a single family or tribe as before, but rather on behalf of the entire community using the site. The new ritual, involving a large sacrifice and a communal meal, introduces a different type of ancestral cult, now intended for both the broader audience of the entire community and the veneration of ancestors in toto. Now the cult acquires a more general chthonic aspect, for which an Eschara was an indispensable feature. Yet its operation did not endure for long. In the early 7th century, another shift in the cultic practices on the terrace occurs. The use of the Eschara was terminated, and a small building, an oikos, was built to replace it as the focus of cultic practices. The oikos was constructed over a number of fire pits that existed in the area. The lower part of its walls was of stone. Entrance to the oikos was at its eastern part through a wide door that was provided with a monolithic threshold. To this door led a narrow lane, perhaps functioning for small processions during rituals. A small stone offering table, looking like a betel, stood at about the center of the room, on the floor that had covered the fire pits. Fragments of a large clay frieze, richly decorated in relief and dating to the early 7th century, was found at the site, assumingly belonging to the small building, to the oikos. This is perhaps the earliest surviving clay frieze in the Greek world. Anyway, the construction of the oikos is not simply an architectural renovation, but a significant shift in the character of the cult and the rituals. The late 8th century, and at some more remote places, the early 7th, represent the period that the newly instituted Polis system was fully implemented in the Greek world. This involved a number of major political and social transformations that affected cultic practices as well. We have here just such a significant change with the construction of the small sacred oikos, we think. In summary, what we have so far on this narrow terrace just outside the cyclopean wall and mostly below the archaic wall represents, we think, the gradual steps of the society living here inside the cyclopean wall to keep pace with current social developments in the Greek world during the geometric period. Leaving this terrace in front of the cyclopean wall with its various distinctive phases of cultic rituals, we now proceed a little farther south, where a small open-air shrine existed. It dates to the end of the geometric period, and it was revealed inside a later 5th century building complex, the Thesmophorium. Thus, it was named the Pre-Thesmophorium Shrine for convenience. The Thesmophorium, and consequently the Pre-Thesmophorium, is located on a narrow terrace outside the archaic wall and in front of the main gate to the settlement. The small shrine that preceded it was established at the end of the 8th century in open space and was located at that time at a distance from the settlement. Settlement here, and that was here. The center of the cult of this early shrine was a large stone-lined hearth and a schara almost at the center of the terrace. There was also a small roofed shed that contained a number of large pithoi, hence it was named the Pithoi Hall. An enclosure wall completed the shrine. The pithoi were all decorated in relief, which helps to date the time span of the shrine's operation from the end of the 8th to the end of the 7th centuries. The 7th century was the heyday of the production of relief pithoi in the Aegean. Tenos was a most important center for the fabrication of these large and richly decorated vases, which, beyond their artistic quality, they also offer a panorama of narrative scenes from Greek mythology. The birth of Athena, dances, Epotnia with upraised hands, centaurs, and many more. The role of the pithoi hall was to receive offerings for the cult taking place here. Perhaps the first fruits and products of crops offered to the shrine, the well-known aparche. Evidently then, although this was a small open-air shrine, it must have been most important for the inhabitants of Xobourgo and their subsistent economy based on farming. The florid of pre-Thesmophorian shrine was the 7th century. In the 6th century, its function seems to decline. It revives much later on, in the 2nd quarter of the 5th century, just after the Persian Wars. The existing architectural parts of the old shrine, that is the schara and the pithoi hall, were kept and incorporated in the new ritual. Thus, now in the 5th century and under Athenian influence, the old open-air shrine becomes a sanctuary and it gets a temple at the center of the terrace with cella and pronos. The sanctuary, as already mentioned, is identified by its finds as a Demeter sanctuary, and more specifically, as a Thesmophorium. According to some ancient writers, Thesmophoria were normally situated outside the settlement near the main gate, and the location of the sanctuary just outside the settlement, Propoleos, and in front of the main gate of the new fortification wall, seems to fit perfectly with this explanation. The small temple built at the center of the narrow terrace was very elaborate, with a pebble floor still surviving at parts, and also a mason's mark on each side, which underlines its importance. The establishment of this small, elaborate temple was accompanied by a sweeping rearrangement of the spaces on the terrace that changed its cultic and religious profile entirely. Two small closed spaces, not necessarily roofed, were created in front of the Pythoid hall, while on the north side of the terrace, two more enclosed spaces were created. The Pythoid hall itself, which remained in use and underwent major changes, it got its final closed rectangular form with a large door opening on the west side, while a bench was added at its north side to better serve rituals and practical needs. The bench is over here. Votives from this sanctuary include, as you can see, Attic red figure painted vases, clay figurines, clay plaques with a female protomy. There are also lots of spindle whorls and lung weights, all basically implying a female deity or a female activity, but also lamps that imply nocturnal activity as required in a thesmophorium. Impressive is also the number of graffiti from this sanctuary. Graffiti that is incised inscriptions on clay objects, such as on vases or spindle whorls and lung weights, include the, that is the motion or the meter, po, poleos, and in one case, polios on the base of a small black glazed cup, all pointing to the public character of the site, and as it seems, to the goddess Demeter. In the Cyclades, sanctuaries securely attributed to Demeter are few, and in none of them is the thesmophoric cult evidenced earlier than the middle of the 5th century. This is then, on present evidence, perhaps the earliest thesmophorion in the Cyclades. The establishment of a cult of Demeter a little before the middle of the 5th century on Xobourgo is a drastic change. A drastic change for the place and for the island too. It seems to have been the result both of Athenian influence and of the character of the pre-thesmophorion cult. The temple that updated the sanctuary introduced a new type of cult related to the Olympian pantheon, while at the same time, the Eschara that remained in use retained a chthonic aspect to proceedings conducted there. The coexistence of a temple and an Eschara in the same sanctuary is a peculiar phenomenon known exclusively from a few Demeter sanctuaries, in which it is explained as due to the chthonic aspect of the goddess Demeter. This brings us directly to the question of the deity of the first shrine at the site with the Eschara and the Pythoid hall. Our data for interpreting that cult are confined beyond the Eschara and the Pythoid hall to the iconography of the relief Pythoid on which frequently there stars a female figure with upraised arms, even if she is involved in a mythical scene. The figure's posture reflects in many ways the old Bronze Age nature goddess, protector of agriculture, which suits perfectly well the situation of the pre-Thesmophorion, a small rural shrine for a vegetation goddess. To this deity, offerings were presented, evidently the first cereals, and other products of the harvest, as implied by the pithoi. The Eschara, on the other hand, a chthonic aspect adds a chthonic aspect to the shrine. In the classical period, such Eschare are almost exclusively associated with the cult of Demeter Chthonii, Demeter Chthonii, who is directly related to the underworld, cultivation and farming. It is not surprising then that when this first cult for a vegetation goddess gave way later in the 5th century to an Olympian deity, it was to Demeter, a goddess closely linked with the earth, cultivation and farming. And now it is time to go to the cemetery of the classical period. This is located on the southeastern side of the hill of Xobourgo. On this strongly sloping hillside, the cemetery develops on 2 successive terraces, one on each side of a wide path that leads up to the eastern fringes of the settlement. On the lower terrace of the cemetery, a number of classical burials have been revealed, while on the upper terrace, there is a series of funerary monuments and other remarkable structures aligned to the road. It is a distinctive special organization, perhaps related to local social conditions, families or tribes using separate graveyards, but it may also imply a different time span for the operations of each terrace. But before going into that, let us have a quick look at the main elements of this cemetery. The burials in the lower terrace are simple and occur in a variety of types: schist tombs, tile tombs, simple pits, amphitheatres, and sarcophagi in clay or stone. They are all inhumation graves and have the same orientation east-west. Schist tombs are the least common. The most representative is tomb 12 on our screen, which was found in a very good condition. There was only a slight disturbance inside due to rainwater that had penetrated the tomb through a crack in the cover. Thus, the skull had become detached from its original position, and after floating about for some time, it ended up at the under end of the tomb, from here down there. You can see that. When, after the excavation, the head was removed from the corner, it was placed at its original position, and here we are. The skeleton was complete, as you can see on our screen. The grave goods in this tomb were an Attic calyx placed on the breast of the deceased and an East Greek aphoriscos moved by the water a little farther up. The date of the tomb is given with accuracy by the Attic cap to the early 5th century. Most of the other burials were in tile graves. The narrow side of the grave, in this case, was always fastened by a single tile, while the long sides were formed by 2 and half tiles of the regular architectural type, frequently painted in a purple color. Sometimes there was also a series of tiles on the floor, but usually the dead body was deposited on the ground. Normally, tile graves were dug into the soft soil, but in one case, shown on our screen, the tile grave 10, was accommodated into a cavity of the bedrock, specially dug out for this purpose. Otherwise, this grave is a good example of a common tile grave with two black painted lekythoi of the 5th century as offerings. A metal object, possibly part of a belt, was found at waist height. No skeletal remains survive because the soil is very acid and bone decay was further accelerated by the high humidity of the place. Yet, a number of teeth belonging to 2 individuals were found in the place where the skull was expected. These remnants of 2 sets of the dentition, imply that the tomb had been used more than once, which is not an uncommon practice at Xobourgo. The same practice was attested at another tile grave, grave 11, in which the skeletal remains of the second burial were relatively well preserved, as you can see here. But from the first burial, only a number of teeth were found, a little farther up than the skull of the second burial. The single offering for the second burial in this grave was an attic black painted killis. The arrangement of tiles on the left side here gives an idea how the second dead was buried. First, one of the tiles, this tile at the western extreme of the grave, was taken out, and the existing remnants of the previous burial were removed. Then the dead body of the second burial was pushed in. Finally, the removed tile was placed back at its original position, while, when needed, a tile wedge was added to cover the gap between this and the following tile. This was a clever trick to avoid having to dismantle the whole existing grave, and it also explains why sometimes the skull of the first body, or occasionally only the teeth that were more durable and so managed to survive, remained in the grave. In other burials, similarly provided with 1 or 2 offerings, there was also a coin set in the mouth of the dead person. This was the case, for instance, in the Sancitrism, a burial in a huge pithos, where the female person, buried together with her child and provided with only 1 small vase, was found with an Athenian silver coin in her mouth. See that here. We must mention also burials in clay or stone sarcophagi, sometimes used more than once too. You can see the lead clamps keeping in place the broken fragments of the floor of the clay sarcophagus, as well as the stone plaque on the narrow side, this is of stone, that replaced the original clay part after it was broken or removed. A number of other burials for infants complete the picture of this small burial ground. They were found basically at the fringes of this burial cluster, mostly by the side of the retaining wall supporting the road. Several different kinds of vases were used for them, such as amphorae, hydria, buckets, and many more, including a fragment of a large clay water pipe. The purification of the graves was achieved either by lighting a fire over it, over the grave, or in a pit next to it. We now have such a fire pit on our screen. Shallow and full of black earth and ashes, set among the graves, it served the purification purposes, evidently for just a short period of time. It was very shallow. No funerary monuments other than crude, artless markers have been found in this burial ground, in the lower terrace. In one case, there was a rectangular, undecorated stone stele, this one, found in situ above a tile grave. Taken together, the simplicity of this burial cluster in the lower terrace implies a small graveyard belonging to a group of families that either did not pay attention to elaborate graves or could not afford them. But the situation is entirely different on the upper terrace, where there is a series of stone monuments alongside the road leading to the settlement. The monuments are flanking the road, or more exactly, facing the road, and appear in a variety of types. The commonest type of monument among those lining the road is the low platform. Platforms are made in different sizes and shapes, basically rectangular, but occasionally adapted to the given space. It is a strange type of monument, not popular in the Cyclades, except perhaps at Hira. Sometimes a flat stone was set on top of the platform, here for example. As such constructions are found covered with traces of fire and ashes, we think that they serve as an improvising offering table. A few cube-like constructions, this one, many more there, scattered among the platforms, form another peculiarity in the cemetery. Some of them are of considerable size, but it is not yet entirely clear whether they crown the grave or that they simply function as an altar-like monument. Traces of ashes found on the platforms or between the platforms, and sometimes between the cubic constructions, imply rituals based on the use of fire. More common, however, are layers of broken vases and tasses in front of the cubic monuments. In these offering places, the commonest vase shapes are the lopas and various types of cups and plates, which evidently were broken on the spot, and thus most of them can be almost fully reconstructed today. Sometimes the vases were provided with a hole in the bottom for liquid rituals. To some extent, these cycladic offering places seem to be close in spirit or repeating the Athenian offering trenches we know from the Athenian Keramites. Evidently related to the preparation of such ritual was the large building squeezed in behind the platforms and the cubic constructions and the higher terrace. This imposing building, 20 meters long, with fine masonry, very similar to that of the Thesmophorian temple, was constructed in the early 5th century on the site of an earlier metal workshop. The floor of the building, circa 20 centimeters thick, entirely covered the open-air metallurgical pits that pre-existed here. The building remained in use for a long time, and in the beginning of the 3rd century, it underwent a renovation. This renovation includes a better floor and the addition of a stone bench built at the northeastern corner of the building. The bench, which measures 2 meters in length, had traces of fire on its upper surface, suggesting ritual in which fire was used. The date of the renovation is given by 3 Tinian coins, carefully placed, as you can see, placed in the foundation of this bench, and also by a coin found on the floor. They are dated by Dr. Sfiroera, who studies the coins from the cemetery, to the early 3rd century. Going back to the funerary monuments alongside the road, on the upper terrace, we should focus on a notable monument consisting of a well-built and relatively high retaining wall, this one, very similar to Athenian monuments known as periboloi, that served as an enclosure wall around a particular area of a family grave plot. As in Athens, here too, a 5th century grave stele was raised above the graves excavated at this place. A number of bases for funerary monuments found alongside the road in front of this monument and farther down emphasize its similarity, the similarity of this setup to Athenian burial practices. Some more graves still that evidently were removed from the cemetery and were found in fragmentary condition, as you can see, built into house or chapel walls in neighboring villages up to 1 kilometer away, indicate the splendor of this cemetery in the classical period. We can see some of them here on our scene in a very fragmentary situation, but still leaving no doubt that they were great works of art. Thus, the fragment from Xinara, a village circa 1.5 kilometers from the cemetery, another from Karia, 1 kilometer from the cemetery, from Tripotamos, 1.5 kilometers away. More pieces of funerary sculpture have been found during the excavation, always in small fragments, but sometimes of a considerable size, like the 2 pieces of a monumental grave monument on our screen, one preserving the side pillar and the other from the entablature of a huge stele, crowned by entablature and pediment and framed by pillars. Smaller finds, such as a human head or an animal paw on our screen, further illustrate the variety of funerary monuments in this cemetery. The wealth and the splendor of the cemetery's grave monuments was suddenly and in an instant made clear in 2019. excavating at the western part of the cemetery's road, we came across a deposit of badly broken grave stelae of the classical period, thrown away randomly. We have the first view of this deposit on our screen and a second and better view of some other fragments found a little farther up, but still inside the same area. The most impressive find within this bunch of fragmentary marble stelae was a large painted stele which had left a very vivid imprint on the soil, as you can see on our screen. The imprint remained glowing for only a few seconds after the stele was removed from its place, and then it disappeared along with the picture and the colors on the stele. We were able to experience a miracle, I think, but sadly only for a few minutes. Another interesting find from the same deposit were two fragments of an inscribed stele found some distance apart. After cleaning, the two fragments were joined together and the inscription running in two rows below the pediment was read, given the name of the dead person in the upper row, Polymidis Sigisagora, and in a third row, possibly the name of his deme, but it was badly damaged. Among the marble fragments from this deposit was also part of a grave stele of the early 5th century in the austere style, preserving the lower body of a young man, probably a teenager. The stele, made in local Tenian marble, is so far the first evidence for the existence of a local workshop for sculpture on the island. As we have seen, there are other contemporary stele from the same cemetery, but they are made in Parian marble. But the most important of the finds in this deposit was a large grave stele of the 4th century, again in local Tenian marble. The stele represents a nude, bearded man accompanied by a small child that embraces his thigh. The face of the man was missing, but 2.5 meters away, a fragment was found face down in the soil. When turned over, it seemed to have the proper dimensions to suit the missing face of the man in the stele, and indeed, it fitted perfectly. The stele was carefully cleaned and the face re-established in its original place, with only a small part of the left side missing. After the restoration, a wonderful piece of art emerged, the work of an experienced and talented sculptor, one who could produce such a piece in the local marble, which, unlike the Parian, is easily broken and flakes, as we can see on the breast of the male figure. It is an important piece, not only artistically, but also archaeologically, as it belongs to the very few grave stele of the classical period known from the Cyclades. The number of surviving grave stele of the classical period in this cemetery implies that this was an important funerary setting of a major polis on Xobourgo, one that had started as a very small settlement on the west side of the hill, fortified with cyclopean walls. In time, it had developed into a major city, evidently the main political and economic center of the island. In the classical period, after the Persian Wars, Tenos developed very close links with Athens, and its culture was largely affected by this. The cult of the matter was introduced, absorbing an older local cult in the open air by the building of a small temple next to an eschara. At the same time, an open-air metal workshop by the cemetery, behind the cemetery actually, was replaced by a large, elaborate building that probably served for the preparation of mortuary rituals. Grave monuments, as we have seen, were now used in the upper terrace to adorn the burials in the Athenian way. In short, Athenian culture was adjusted to fit current trends and evidently upgraded. This then is the history of the people living at Xobourgo that we have tried to present in the time allowed. I hope you have enjoyed its exposition. But before closing, let me express my sincere thanks to the people standing by our side, our team members, students and workers, for their dedication and for overcoming with good humor and skill all the difficulties arising at this tough and demanding setting. Also, to our sponsors, the Athanasius and Marina Martinos Foundation and the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Insular Policy. Likewise, to the effort of the Cyclades, Dr. Angelopoulou in particular, and the Tenos Museum guards and conservators for facilitating our study. And I also thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kourou. This was fascinating, a very interesting sites, lovely finds, and a very well-structured presentation. Thank you so much. And now I would like to call upon Professor Irene Lemos, our academic advisor, to give us the vote of thanks. Irene?
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, really an amazing lecture. So yes, my name is Irene Lemos and I'm professor of classical archaeology at the University of Oxford and the founding member of the Greek Archaeological Committee, UK. It's indeed a great honor and pleasure to give the vote of thanks for the excellent lecture delivered by Professor Nota Kourou. It is also a very moving occasion for me since I had the fortune to be one of the students in the first ever class that Professor Kourou taught at the University of Athens upon her return from Oxford after finishing her doctorate. Since then, she has taught generations of students, and as you heard from our chair earlier on, among them, some have been scholars of the Greek Archaeological Committee. All of Professor Kourou's students, we have been benefited of her deep knowledge and great enthusiasm regarding the archaeology of early Greece, a period to which she has made an immense contribution with her research and meticulous publications. Tonight, we heard the results of her great contribution to the archaeology of Xobourgo on the island of Tenos. What an amazing location and site. I hope you enjoyed all those amazing photographs of Xobourgo. Well, Professor Kourou's investigations there have revealed evidence of the diachronic history of this important site from the early Iron Age to the late classical, and I think they have even later Hellenistic finds as well. She has both excavated and provided an intelligent and sound reconstructions of her discoveries, because the work of a field archaeologist is not only to excavate, but to give explanations and reconstructions of what they have found. And I think we had an excellent display of this tonight. So during this long period of occupation, discoveries at Xobourgo, whose name in antiquity was Polis, as we learned from the ancient inscriptions, provide important information regarding its ancient inhabitants and allow us to reconstruct their homes, sacred and public places, and their cemeteries. Impressive are the early traces of ancestral cult inside enclosure walls, showing complex cultic activities practiced at first by families that form the local community and which continue into later periods and then were of course performed by the whole community of the site, the Polis. Another important discovery is that of the earliest thesmophorion in the Cyclades, with significant finds associated with the cult of Demeter. Important also, as we have seen, are the finds from the so carefully excavated classical cemetery, where impressive burial practices were discovered closely associated with funerary rituals. Impressive also is the funerary perivolos of the 5th century with stelai similar in style as those from the Athenian Keramaikos, as Professor Nota Kourou noted. Among the stelae discovered recently in 2019, a number of them are extremely exciting, especially of course this large stele of local marble of the man and the child. What an amazing discovery, and what an amazing job to put the finds together and to reconstruct the whole stele. So the discoveries and the material culture of Xobourgo, as we have seen tonight, are rich and impressive, offering an abundance of evidence and allowing us, thanks to the investigations of Professor Kourou and her dedicated teams, to reconstruct the history of this important capital of the island of Tenos in antiquity. We are grateful to her for guidance through her discoveries to such a significant and important site of the Cyclades, and we wish her and her teams the best of luck for any future investigations at Xobourgo. Thank you so much, Nota. That was a great lecture, as ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Eri. Yes, we all hope to see more new finds and new results. Now, if you wish to contact us, make a donation or be on our mailing list, all information is on the screen now, and the copy can be found on chat, which you can download.